In this video, I'm going to talk about accords and perfumery. I'm going to go over what an accord is, talk about the different types of accord, and then finally I'm going to teach you how to make an accord, or at least the method that I use, so hopefully you can find it useful and maybe use it to make your own accords. Okay then, so what is an accord? Well, an accord is a blend of two or more ingredients in order to create something else, firstly. So this means you could have simply two ingredients on their own and they could make an accord, or you could have 100 or even 1,000 ingredients all mixed together in one accord. It's still an accord. The second point about an accord though is that everything in the accord, or the accord as a whole, has some kind of harmonious effect. That's to say, the accord is more than the sum of its parts. One good way of looking at an accord is a bit like a chord in music. So you may have 3 or 4 notes which go together to make a chord. And while if your ear is trained, or in perfumery your nose is trained, you can pick out the individual notes. When you listen to the chord as a whole, it sounds like a single entity. It sounds like this one harmonious thing. And this is then something you can go on to use, for example, as a building block to build up a full composition, or in the perfumery case, you could use many chords and single notes together to make your final composition, which is your perfume. Next then, so what different categories of accords are there? Obviously, on a kind of superficial level, you've got all of the different smells that the accord could be. So it could be a green accord, or an aquatic accord, or a woody accord, that kind of thing. But I do think it's helpful to have a bit more of a kind of macroscopic way of categorizing accords as well. So the 3 categories that I like to put accords into are what I call the olfacto-realistic accords, the minimalist or impressionist accords, and then the abstract accords. So what are each of these categories? Well, olfacto-realistic, I don't know if that's actually a word, I made it up, but to me it's kind of like photorealistic, right? If you're doing a photorealistic drawing, you're trying to replicate with accuracy exactly what you see in front of you, just like in a photograph. So as an artist, to do that, you need to be extremely technically good in order to get a very accurate proportion representation of the thing in front of you. In perfumery, this is a bit like making something that smells exactly as it smells in real life. So if you were going to make a rose, this might be going through the thousands of molecules inside a rose and painstakingly putting them together in the same kind of proportions to get a really, really accurate rose. Now, this is something that the big multinational fragrance companies do, and they use a lot of expensive equipment in their chemistry labs to help with this, though it's not something that's so easy for us to do if we're just trying to make perfume at home. That said, you still can make quite complex, realistic accords from home. It's just that it's going to be very difficult to do this consistently without all the kind of chemistry lab stuff, because it's going to just take you such a long time. Okay then, so what are the impressionistic or the minimalist accords? These are accords that are meant to smell like something, however they're much more like a loose sketch. They're meant to give you the impression of the thing, but do it in a very simple way. So for example, the pineapple accord that I made the other day, I'll link the video to it, that would count as an impressionistic or a minimalistic accord, because I only did it with 5 ingredients. It was just the kind of bare minimum you need to smell the pineapple. You could argue that when I had the first 3 ingredients, even that is a impressionistic, minimalist accord. And then as I start adding more things to try to make it more realistic, it goes more towards the olfacto-realistic kind of side of things. One perfumer who's very famous for making these kind of impressionistic or minimalist accords is Jean-Claude Ellena. I did a video reviewing his book, The Alchemy of Scent, which is an excellent book where he goes over some things like, for example, olfactory illusions, as he calls them, and combinations of 2, 3, or 4 simple ingredients you can use to make impressions of fruits. So if you're interested in that, look in the comments and I'll put a link for you. Anyway, the last type of accord is what's called the abstract accords. So this is basically everything that's not trying to be a real thing. An abstract accord could be anything you want it to be. It could have any ingredients, and it's not necessarily trying to go after something in the real world so much, but an abstract accord is literally anything you could imagine that's kind of still an accord, so this harmonious combination. So you could marry together things that are completely unrelated or never smelled together in the real world, but turns out they blend together to make this really nice new smell that you have to discover. So that would be an abstract accord. So one good example of an abstract accord in classical perfumery is the fougère, which is the kind of fern accord. And the reason that's an abstract accord is because it's completely a fantasy accord. It's meant to smell like a fern, but the reality is a fern doesn't actually have a smell. So it's just kind of like a complete abstract artistic interpretation of what a fern might smell like. One final point is that naturals are a bit like nature's accords. So if you think about it, when you have a natural product, there are actually lots of different molecules that are put there by the plant. So when we extract that as like an essential oil or an absolute, we still have all of those different molecules. So it's kind of like a composition as such of an accord made by nature or made by the plant. One thing you can do is you can actually look at the major constituents of a natural product and try to recreate some kind of accord version of it yourself by putting those major constituents together and seeing what those smell like in the same proportions. I did some videos on naturals when I was starting my channel, and I gave some sheets with some PDFs which showed the kind of chemical constituents or the composition of some of these naturals to some degree, just the major kind of elements. I've now also released those sheets, so if you're looking to get the PDFs, you can download them for free just by signing up to the mailing list on my web store. Okay then, so when are you ready to start making accords? I would say that it's actually really important to learn your ingredients individually before you start blending them, otherwise you start getting really confused with what's going on. I made a video about how to learn the ingredients, so I'll put a link to that as well if you haven't already watched it. But once you've got a good grasp on your ingredients, then is a good time to start thinking about how to blend things. Now, the method that I'm going to talk about in the video is the method that I came up with, or the method how I like to blend accords. However, there are other methods out there as well. So for example, the Jean Carles method is very famous. There's a PDF document which explains this method, so I'll put a link to that in the description as well. If you're interested on reading like a more standard method, then definitely go check that out. Okay then, so before we start actually making an accord, I'm going to talk about what we want to avoid doing and what kind of the big problems are. Especially which I had when I was starting out making accords, and I think a lot of people have the same kind of problems, and I think it's one of the probably the biggest reasons that it's easy to kind of quit perfumery. Basically, when you add a lot of things into your blend straight away, and when you just start mixing a lot of things together, especially if you're not very familiar with your ingredients, what's usually going to happen is you get something coming out which smells worse than everything you put in. So the reason I think this seems to happen is that most things, when you blend them together, actually smell worse than the individual ingredients. I do find that it's actually less common that you blend two things together and they actually smell better and they still smell nice. It's more common, I think, that I find things that clash, and I think that's the reason that blending lots of things together is not so good, because the more things you have in the mixture, the more things or the more possibilities there are to clash. So I'm going to illustrate this with a quick example. Say you've got two things in your mixture. There's only one interaction between them. So if it goes well or goes badly, then you're going to be able to work out, is the interaction good or bad? When you mix three things together, there's now suddenly three interactions to kind of take care of. Now, by adding one extra thing, you've added two more potential interactions where something could go wrong. And remember, all it takes is for one of these interactions to smell bad or be not quite right for the whole accord to start smelling bad. Then if you add one more component, you go up again by three whole more interactions. So by adding an extra component, that's an extra 33% of ingredients you've added, but you've added an extra three interactions. So you've doubled the number of interactions. Then when you go up to 5, once again, you add 4 more interactions just by adding one more ingredient. So the more ingredients you add together, the more things are to go wrong. Once you just make 5 things together into an accord, you've already got 10 interactions to worry about. So if you've never studied any of those interactions before, of course it's much more likely that you're going to have a bad interaction in there and make the whole accord smell bad than a situation where everything just happily manages to magically work with each other. I think a really good analogy for this is kind of, imagine you went to a kitchen and you had all the ingredients laid out in front of you, but you'd never cooked anything or eaten any food before in your life. Because that's kind of how we are when we start out in perfumery. We've not smelled all of the things before. We don't know how they act over time. We don't know how all the ingredients perform over time. And we don't know which things blend together in kind of a recipe as such. So then, let's say you're in this kitchen. You might kind of have an inkling of an idea for what might make up a stew. So you maybe get some beef and you get some carrots and put them together in your pot. But also you realize that cake is really, really nice and chocolate is really, really nice. So you think, well, these ingredients are already nice, so I'm going to put them together in my stew. Of course, what's going to happen is once you start eating the stew and you're going to try it, it's going to be a disaster because the cake and the chocolate don't fit well with the carrots and the beef. What might make a really good stew is if you actually were to put celery and potatoes with the carrots and beef instead, because those combinations of flavors work together more. The problem is though, on their own, the celery tastes pretty horrible and the potatoes don't taste so good, raw potatoes. So why on earth would you ever think in the first place to add those ingredients to the stew? Also, once you've made your disgusting stew, what reason would you have to think that it's the cake or the chocolate causing it? Because all you really know is that on their own they taste nice. So it's going to be hard for you to realize that those things are the things actually that are not working with the other things. But then, if you are at this situation, there is one way you could work out if it was in fact the cake making the stew taste worse. Say you made the stew with just the beef and the carrots, and then you made another version which was exactly the same, but the only difference was you added the cake. This time, you've only got one interaction that you're studying, so there's only one variable or one thing that's changed. If you do this, then you can easily, quite quickly work out, is the cake working in the stew or is it not? So in my opinion, when we're making accords in perfume, we want to do a similar thing to what we did just now with the stew. We want to test one ingredient at a time, and we want to see, does that work with our other ingredients or not? That's the basis of my method. It's also the basis of the Jean Carl's method. And I think probably most good methods of making an accord will go with this kind of step-by-step thing where you only change one variable at a time in most parts. If you are a very experienced perfumer and you know the ingredients extremely well, then of course you can start changing more things at once because you're kind of a master at that stage. You've got kind of the mental capacity to go and do that. But for most of us, myself included, it's very difficult to get anywhere by changing too much at once. The best thing to do is just to zoom in and focus on one thing at a time. And when we're doing that, we can slowly move our accord into the right direction. It takes a lot of trial blends, but it's worth it in the end because at least we can actually get a nice result. And also you learn so much about the effects of your materials with other materials by doing this. So it really helps you to become a better perfumer, and in the future, maybe you will be able to just start throwing random things together and it will still smell nice when you've got all of that experience behind you. So then what is my method of making an accord? Well, there are two simple steps and you're basically just repeating these two steps again and again and again. So let's have a hypothetical example where we wanted to start off with cedarwood and ambroxan. So the first step would be to kind of work out the relative levels of these two materials. So from experience, ambroxan is fairly strong, while cedarwood isn't quite so strong. So the first thing to do is I would take my cedarwood and my ambroxan and I would take my different dilutions. So I normally have a 10%, a 1% and an 0.1%. Maybe if you're just starting out, you don't need to have all of those dilutions, but I would probably recommend at least having a 10% and a 1% dilution of each material so you know how it works at those two levels, because those really are the ones you use all the time. So I would have my ambroxan at 10% and my ambroxan at 1%, and then I would have my cedarwood at 10% and my cedarwood at 1%. I would then take 2 scent strips and I would take, for example, the 10% one of the ambroxan and the 10% one of the cedarwood. I would then take those and I would smell them together. And then I would try to work out, firstly, does ambroxan work with cedarwood or not? Because if it doesn't, then we can stop right here. Then we can just say this combination is not so good and we can try something else. But if it does work together, then the question becomes, okay, what about the relative level? Are the proportions right? So I find that ambroxan is quite strong compared to cedarwood. So I would probably say, no, the ambroxan is too strong in this situation. So then what I would do is I would take 2 new scent strips and I would still dip one in the 10% of the cedarwood, but then I would go down to the 1% for the ambroxan, and then I would smell them together again and see, okay, now are they more balanced? So you can keep trying this on the scent strips as a really cheap and easy way just to test if things go together before you actually have to go and use a whole bottle and actually all the pipettes to go and blend them together. Once you have found a blend or some proportions you think could work, then you go to stage 2, which is actually making a trial blend of this combination. So then, in this situation, say I think the cedarwood at 10% goes well with the ambroxan at 1%. I would take my sample bottle, I would label it trial 1, and what I would do is firstly write down the formula, and I would write cedarwood 10%, 0.1 grams, and then I would write ambroxan 1%, 0.1 grams. So at this stage, I'm just testing if these two different concentrations work together in a 1-to-1 ratio. So then I would take my pipettes, take my scales, and using a fresh pipette for each, I would take firstly 0.1 grams of the cedarwood at 10%, put that in my trial 1 bottle. Then I would take 0.1 grams of the ambroxan at 10% and put that in the bottle. Then I put the lid on, give it a shake, and then take a new scent strip again, and then smell it from the bottle, and then I have another chance to evaluate. Does it still smell balanced? Because obviously you can do things on the scent strips, but until you actually blend them, you're not going to know for sure if that's kind of the right ratio. Now, in this situation, it might be fine straight away, which means you can continue. However, more often than not, you're going to find that one thing is still a bit too strong, or maybe actually when you actually mix them together, they don't go together as well as you thought they might have before, in which case you might want to abandon that trial. But let's say the ambroxan and the cedarwood are working together. You got them in the 1-to-1 ratio at those pre-dilutions. So it's important to realize that that 1-to-1 ratio is actually a 1-to-10 ratio of pure stuff because one's diluted 10 times more. But in terms of the pre-dilutions, they're in a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, let's say that the ambroxan didn't quite feel strong enough now. So I could, if it was just a slight amount, it's kind of a slight effect, say I thought the ambroxan just needed to be boosted just a little bit compared to the cedarwood, what I could then go and do is make another trial blend. So I could call it trial 1A or 1B, or I could call it trial 2, depending on how I want to name things. This time I would put 0.1 grams of the cedarwood at 10%, but then I would increase the ambroxan by, say, double. So this time I would use 0.2 grams of ambroxan at 1%. Now I'm using a 1-to-2 ratio, or a 1-to-2 ratio in the pre-dilution, but a 1-to-5 ratio if you actually looked at the pure materials. But again, we can kind of ignore that for now because we're looking at things in terms of the pre-dilution. So now I make the other trial blend, I give my nose a chance to rest, and then I again take a scent strip, label that, and evaluate it. Now let's say that I still think the ambroxan isn't strong enough, or I think that, it really needs to be significantly stronger. Well, then I can go up in the pre-dilution instead of the ratio that I use. So in this situation, I could say, okay, scrap using ambroxan at 1%, let's go back up to using it at 10%, and then let's go back to the 1-to-1 ratio and see if that works. Because then in this case, we're using a 1-to-1 ratio of pre-diluted materials, but because now the pre-dilutions are the same percentage, that means we're also using a 1-to-1 ratio of the actual materials. So now I would be trying a 1-to-1 ratio of actual ambroxan to actual cedarwood. So yeah, basically this is just balancing one, what I call binary combination. So you've got two things making a binary and a combination, you're combining them together. Now the key thing about this method of building accords is that when you only use binary combinations, you're only ever studying that one interaction, because no matter how complex one of the mixtures is, you're only ever studying the interaction of that as a whole with the new thing that you're adding. It's a bit like the stew example. Even if there's already beef and carrots and potatoes together in to begin with, and you're just trying to work out, does celery go well with it or not? It doesn't matter that there's 3 individual things in there. You're just thinking, hey, does general stew base go well with celery? You're not thinking, does carrot go well with celery, plus does beef go well with celery, plus does potatoes go well with celery? If that kind of makes sense. And it's exactly the same thing here. When you then go to repeat this process, now you're going to use your trial blend from before on one of the scent strips, and then you're going to use the new next ingredient. So say we wanted to put some ironone with it. Then we would take trial blend 1 on one scent strip, and then we would take some ironone. And then we would try to balance the level of ironone relative to the trial blend that we've made. Then next time we go to write our formula, what I like to do is I still leave all of the entries in the formula from before. So I still write, hey, we've added cedarwood at 0.1 grams, we've added ambroxan at 0.1 grams of 1% dilution, say instead of 10%. And then I'll add the new entries, say for the ironone. Let's say again, we found we liked it at 1%, so now we try 0.1 grams of ironone with that. The key thing here is that all of the rows above that final row, we treat that as if it were just one base. We kind of treat that as if it were a single grouped together ingredient. Now, one final point in this process is the more ingredients you add, actually the more dilute everything's gonna become, because in a sense, each new ingredient is getting diluted by the others. So what this kind of does as an overall effect is means all of your trial blend as such is getting weaker. So overall, when you're blending quite a few things together, you'll actually find that everything in the mixture is quite a bit weaker than those initial scent strips you were using to begin with. I like to solve this problem by always going up by one extra step, so one order of magnitude. So for example, 10 instead of 1%, than I would have used on those initial scent strips. So say to begin with, I liked 1% for ambroxan, I would actually be using 10%, and cedarwood, maybe instead of using 10%, I would use it pure. And the reason for this is by the time I've added 5 or 6 ingredients and done enough cycles of this, everything will have been diluted down enough so that that cedarwood is kind of effectively at 10% again, and that ambroxan is essentially at 1% again. If this final point sounds confusing to you, and you don't like doing the maths of percentages and things, honestly, just ignore it. Don't worry about it too much. But if you are interested in kind of keeping things a little bit more consistent, then I would definitely think about doing this. Unfortunately, this is just one thing that occurs because of the method of using pre-dilutions instead of only using pure perfume materials. So for example, if we only ever used the raw ingredients in their pure form and then topped it up with ethanol to dilute it, we could mitigate this problem. But on the flip side, we would then have the much bigger problem of all of our ingredients being really expensive because we're burning through so many all the time. So of course you can actually do things even better by using a lot of maths, but I'm guessing for most people they don't really want to do that. If you're quite strong at maths and you think it's quite easy to go and do all of the percentages and things to keep, for example, the overall concentration constant or the concentration of the individual ingredients constant, depending on which you prefer, then feel free to go and work through all of that and do it that way. And yeah, so that's pretty much all there is to it. So one final thing you can do if you want to is once you've got all of the ratio of the pure ingredients that you know you like in your accord, you can go and make a pure concentrate version of the accord. So that's kind of a version of the accord without any of the pre-dilutions. You can work out just the pure amounts of each material and blend those together in a concentrate. You can then go and dilute that down to, for example, 10% and 1% like the other ingredients, treat it as just any other ingredient, and more importantly, you can then go and use that to blend into your perfumes as if it was just another ingredient. But the cool thing about it is it's your accord which you made yourself. Anyway then, so that's everything. I hope this video wasn't too complicated. If there was something that you found confusing, please just leave a comment below and I'll try to answer it and help if I can. But other than that, thanks for watching and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.